Night settled over the valley like a hand pressed against the earth. The desert air hung still. Even the crickets had gone silent. Below the hill, torches burned in a perfect line. A procession of light stretching toward something massive, half finished, half sacred. The first temple of Jerusalem, but if one listened closely, one would hear nothing. No clang of hammer on iron, no chisels striking stone. Thousands worked beneath that silence. Laborers from Tyre, quarrymen from Lebanon, artisans from Israel. Each man knew his task, and none dared break the rule. The command was clear: no tool of iron shall be heard in the house while it is being built. That silence was not peace, it was power. Solomon's order defied logic. But here, in Jerusalem, at the height of Israel's golden age, the greatest construction in its history was wrapped in silence. Stones were cut far away, in the quarries of Zeradah, shaped, smoothed, and measured to divine specification, only when each block was perfect, only when no hammer was needed, were they transported up to the mount and slid into place like verses in a psalm. Each wall rose not with the sound of progress, but with the discipline of obedience. Archaeologists still argue over the practicality of such a rule. Was it symbolic or literal? Could tens of thousands of workers truly maintain that silence? The Bible says yes, but within the myth lies something deeper, an engineering of theology itself. The silence was not to honor God's ears. It was to control men's tongues. Solomon was no ordinary monarch. He ruled a kingdom at its peak. 12 tribes, unified and rich, their borders secure. But with peace came danger, the danger of idleness, dissent, and questions. A temple could answer all three. It would unite the tribes under one faith, cement his legitimacy as David's heir, and give the people a purpose that didn't involve rebellion. But this was not a place of worship alone. It was a declaration of permanence, an empire's manifesto carved in limestone. To build a house for the divine was to claim an ownership of the divine, and that required more than prayer. It required engineering. The materials came from everywhere. Lebanon's cedar forests, felled by Phoenician axes and floated south along the coast. Blocks of limestone, quarried and shaped in silence, hauled on wooden sleds up the slope to Mount Moriah. Gold from Ophir, bronze from the Jordan plain, blue and purple linen from Tyre. The logistics alone rivaled any ancient war campaign. Hiram, king of Tyre, provided ships, carpenters, and bronze workers. In return, Solomon sent wheat, oil, and wine, a barter of sustenance for sanctity. What emerged was an alliance not of faith, but of function. The ancient world's first religious industrial complex. From every direction, caravans flowed into Jerusalem. 150,000 men worked across the kingdom. The cost of devotion was counted in labor quotas and taxation tables. Solomon's wisdom had become administration, his prayer, policy. No one alive had seen the Ark of the Covenant for a generation. It was said to hold the presence of God, the same presence that once guided Israel through the wilderness, that felled Jericho's walls, that struck down Uzzah for touching it without permission. Now Solomon intended to house it. The plans were divine, given, the scribe said, to David by God himself. But even divine blueprints require the mortal execution. The temple's measurements, 60 cubits long, 20 wide, 30 high, mirrored cosmic order. 3 divisions, like the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. The inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was a perfect cube, a geometry of divinity, unseen but precise. The entire structure aligned with the rising sun on specific days. A choreography of light, every beam, every window, calculated not for beauty, but for revelation. This was theology as architecture, faith rendered in dimension and weight. Imagine standing there, a mason in the valley, your chisel forbidden to ring. You cut stone by moonlight. You measure each angle twice, because error means humiliation. Or worse, waste. You cannot test the fit by sound, only by sight. Each block must meet another, without correction. The silence becomes oppressive. It drills into your mind like prayer. Repeated until it becomes reflex. Days blend into weeks. The city hums above. Priests chant below. But the valley remains quiet. The engineers claim it is efficiency. The priests call it holiness. But to the laborer, it feels like exile. You are not building a house for God. You are building his prison. To rule an empire by sword is costly. To rule it by scripture is efficient. Solomon understood both. By declaring the temple's silence holy, he made obedience a ritual. The people were not just building walls. They were training themselves to revere command. Every stroke unspoken became an act of loyalty. Every breath withheld became worship. The silence spread. From the quarry to the capital, from laborers to priests, it became culture, then doctrine, then faith. And when silence becomes sacred, dissent becomes sin. When the final stone was set, the workmen laid down their tools. They had labored for 7 years. No trumpet marked the moment. No announcement from the palace. Only wind moving through the cedar beams. Only the faint shimmer of moonlight on gold. The people waited for Solomon to speak. But even the king said nothing. The legend says he walked alone through the courtyard, past the bronze pillars Jachin and Boaz, past the altar, into the empty inner chamber, where the ark would soon rest. There, he knelt and whispered the first sound the temple had heard in 7 years. It is finished. Alkarndu. The silence had done its work. The empire had built its faith. The king had built his throne. And the people, obedient, awed, exhausted, believed that God himself had moved in. They didn't realize until much later that the silence had never left. When the silence of the valley became the empire's heartbeat, the man behind it, the man who commanded silence itself, walked among his plans. Solomon was 40 years old when the temple rose above the skyline of Jerusalem. He ruled a kingdom stretched from the borders of Egypt to the Euphrates, the widest realm ever claimed in the name of Yahweh. And yet, history remembers him not for conquest, but for construction. He built something that no sword could conquer. But to understand that, you must see the king not as a saint, but as an engineer. Solomon's legend begins in paradox. He was the son of war, David's blood, but born into peace. His father's sword had secured the borders. His father's sins had stained them. From that contradiction rose a single idea. If war forged the empire, faith would preserve it. Solomon saw what David could not, that a nation cannot live forever on victory. It needs a story, and so he set out to build one in stone. The temple was that story. Every wall was a verse. Every column, a law, every measure, a covenant. But Solomon's genius was not architectural. It was political. He saw that the sacred could legitimize the secular, that a building could anchor a throne more deeply than an army. The design, they said, was divine, handed down through David by revelation. But revelations do not come with schematics. Solomon's scribes translated vision into geometry. They measured faith in cubits, 60 by 20 by 30. A code of balance, a reflection of the ancient Mesopotamian ratios of order and cosmos. 3 chambers, the vestibule, where men entered, the holy place, where priests stood, the Holy of Holies, where no one but God could dwell. The temple was not merely built. It was layered, each threshold narrowed, each chamber dimmed, each step purified. From noise to silence, from crowd to solitude, from man to mystery, it was a psychological architecture, a funnel of reverence engineered to control experience. To achieve perfection, Solomon turned outward. To the Phoenicians, Tyre, the merchant city of the sea, was the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, where wood met bronze and trade met mathematics. King Hiram of Tyre supplied cedar, craftsmen, and a man named Hiram Abif, a metallurgist whose name would outlive even Solomon's. Hiram's job, to design the pillars, vessels, and ornaments of the temple. Each one a sermon in bronze. Under his direction, the valley at Zarethan burned day and night, smelting copper from the earth, pouring liquid fire into molds lined with sand and oil. The molten metal glowed blue under the desert night. They called it the blue fire of Tyre. Bronze, the alloy of heaven and earth, made from the red of copper and the white of tin, became a theology in metal. When the temple neared completion, 2 massive bronze pillars were raised before its entrance. They were named Jachin and Boaz. To the untrained eye, they were ornaments. To the priests, they were mysteries. Jachin, he establishes. Boaz, in his strength. Together, they formed a declaration. The empire stands because God wills it, and the king rules because God allows it. It was not faith. It was propaganda in holy language. Every man entering the temple passed beneath those words, submitting to the authority they proclaimed. In that way, the architecture preached, and the empire listened. Solomon's alliance with Tyre went beyond stone and timber. It was a treaty of theology. Israel's God was invisible. The Phoenicians' gods were carved in gold and cedar. By merging the 2 worlds, the abstract and the tangible, Solomon created something no kingdom had before. A visible, invisible God. The temple became a lens through which heaven could be governed. Gold reflected light like revelation. Cedar held fragrance like prayer. Bronze shimmered like authority. It was sensory theology, a kingdom's faith, designed to be felt. But for all its sanctity, every inch of it was calculated. The chamber dimensions aligned with the solar calendar. The porch faced east, catching the sunrise on specific feast days, casting light directly upon the inner curtain. To worship here was to move through time and geometry simultaneously, a choreography of submission. The house of God had become the machine of empire. By the 4th year of his reign, Solomon controlled the most advanced economy in the Near East. Silver was said to be worthless. Gold flowed into Jerusalem like water, but every coin carried a shadow. The temple's splendor came from somewhere: taxation, forced labor, conscription. 30,000 men sent to Lebanon in shifts, 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 stone cutters. They built God's house as prisoners of his promise. Every block of limestone was a tithe of human fatigue. Every cubit of cedar measured in hours of sweat. The scripture says Solomon was wise. The records say he was efficient. Silence had become law. And faith, its justification. Solomon's brilliance lay not in invention, but in adaptation. He took the political theology of Egypt, the craftsmanship of Tyre, the logistics of Mesopotamia, and merged them into something terrifyingly new: a unified sacred state. The temple was both palace and altar, a dual-purpose structure where kingship and priesthood blurred. The priests served the rituals, but the king owned the rituals. The holy place was a throne room in disguise. When the priests entered, they approached not only the divine, but the king's version of it. That was Solomon's true genius. He didn't build a temple for God. He built one for belief itself. As the final gold panel was set, Solomon walked the perimeter of the site. He touched the walls, each cool beneath his hand, each flawless, silent. He thought of his father, a man of war, forbidden to build this house because his hands had shed blood. Now Solomon's hands had shed none, but the silence itself had become a weapon. He had achieved peace, not by defeating enemies, but by absorbing them into worship. And in that peace, there was no room for sound. When dawn rose over Jerusalem, the temple's roof caught the first light of the sun. From the hills, it looked as though the mountain itself glowed. Pilgrims fell to their knees, priests lifted their eyes, and somewhere above them all, a single voice whispered what would echo for centuries. The king has built what even God desired, and what no man dares question. The temple was complete in form, but not yet in purpose. For within its walls, the divine would soon be trapped, and the silence would begin to speak. Before the temple became legend, it was labor. And before Solomon's wisdom built a kingdom of light, it forged a machine of burden. By the 5th year of Solomon's reign, Jerusalem had become a living construction site. Caravans moved day and night through the mountain passes. Cedar logs dragged from Lebanon, quarried limestone hauled from the plains. From the hills of Ephraim to the shore of Joppa, the roads thundered not with war chariots, but with oxen and slaves. 30,000 men were conscripted from the tribes of Israel. They worked in rotations. 10,000 per month in Lebanon under Tyrian overseers. At home, 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stone cutters labored in the mountains. 150,000 souls. Their names forgotten, their hands remembered in every seam of the wall. The temple's silence, once praised as holiness, was now the sound of exhaustion. Solomon's father had ruled through the sword. Solomon ruled through law. He didn't conquer his neighbors. He recruited them. He didn't enslave his enemies. He taxed his allies. The Book of Kings calls them forced laborers. But in Hebrew, the term is mas, tribute, obligation. It was not slavery by chain, but by decree. Each tribe owed bodies as payment for peace. Each man's silence was an offering to the crown. It was faith as labor policy, a theology of obedience written into administration. Work began before dawn. By torchlight, the first teams entered the quarry. They carved white limestone from the mountain with copper saws and wooden wedges soaked in water. Primitive hydraulics expanding the cracks until stone gave way. No iron tools were allowed. Iron was the metal of war, forbidden in the house of peace. So they labored longer, slower, quieter. At the quarries, the air was thick with lime dust. At the cedar mills, sawdust drifted like golden smoke. At the bronze foundries of the Jordan Plain, molten metal poured like rivers of sun. The engineers from Tyre supervised each division, recording dimensions, scheduling transport, measuring progress to the cubit. The operation resembled less a holy mission and more a war economy. Each man's exhaustion was logged like inventory. Each delay was reported up the chain, not to the priesthood, but to the palace. When Hiram's ships reached Joppa with cedar logs, the lumber was dragged 40 miles inland. Uphill, an army of oxen strained against the ropes. Archaeologists still trace those grooves, the tracks of faith turned freight. From there, The materials climbed to Mount Moriah, a ridge once called the threshing floor of Araunah. It was said Abraham had offered Isaac there. Now, the children of Abraham offered themselves. Each beam was polished until it gleamed like honey, each block fitted in silence, the joints sealed with molten lead. The perfection Solomon demanded was not architectural, it was moral. Error was blasphemy, exhaustion was expected. And still the king's scribes wrote, "The work pleased the Lord. There are no inscriptions bearing the names of the mason. No genealogies list the craftsmen who laid the foundation." The records remember Solomon. They remember Hiram. They remember the temple. They do not remember the men. History, as it often does, kept the architect and forgot the builders. In Tyre, the Phoenician masters signed their work in bronze. In Egypt, the Pharaoh's engineers carved their names into stone. But here, in Jerusalem, anonymity was holiness. Silence had become sanctity, identity, erased in service of divine perfection. This was Solomon's greatest invention. Not the temple, but the system that built it, a human engine disguised as worship. The same king who wrote proverbs about justice also wrote decrees about quotas, 1 talent of silver from each province, 1/10 of grain, oil, and livestock from each household, and for every 50 men. 1 month in service. The priests called it divine order. The scribes called it efficiency. The people called it endurance. At the height of the building, the economy of faith consumed the entire nation. Farmers lost sons to the quarries. Merchants lost caravans to conscription. Gold meant for trade was poured into altars. And still the prophets were silent. The temple was nearly done, and with it, the king's image, a God of law, not mercy. But not everyone bowed quietly. Among the northern tribes, murmurs began to spread that Solomon's peace was heavier than David's wars. When the king's tax collectors reached the hill country of Ephraim, villagers hid their sons in the vineyards. When overseers demanded more workers, the irony was unbearable. The builder of God's house had turned God's people into Egypt again. The scriptures say that Solomon heard no rebuke during the temple years. The prophets, Gad, Nathan, Ahijah, fell silent. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they believed the king truly acted under divine wisdom, or perhaps the silence itself was the judgment. Because when men stop speaking truth to power, the stones begin to echo it instead. The temple's walls were perfect, but beneath them, the foundation trembled with exhaustion. The kingdom looked holy. It sounded holy, but its holiness was measured in man-hours. 7 years of construction, 7 years of quotas, silence, and sweat. When the final panel of gold was installed behind the veil, Solomon stood upon the steps of the courtyard and looked out over the crowd. Tens of thousands knelt before him. Their faces reflected the light of the altar. Not as worshippers, but as witnesses. They had given their lives to build perfection, and in that perfection, they had vanished. The priests sang. Trumpets blared once, then fell quiet. A wind passed over the city, and in that wind, some swore they heard voices, the murmuring of those buried in the quarries. The sighs of men who had labored in silence so another could speak to God. When night fell, the torches along the temple walls burned like a second horizon. The city glowed gold. The valley below, black. For the first time in centuries, Israel had peace, not the peace of justice, but the peace of exhaustion. In the archives of Tyre, a line was written, "The Hebrews pay in silence. Their king builds in glory. Their God demands both." The next morning, Solomon would dedicate the temple, but before the trumpet sounded, before the ark was brought in, before heaven was asked to descend, The ground already carried the weight of something divine, and something broken. Night turned the valley to iron. The stars burned pale above the Jordan plain. But below, another constellation glowed. Furnaces, hundreds of them. From a distance, they looked like a second sky fallen to earth. Each flame a heartbeat of the empire. This was Zarethan, where the Phoenicians from Tyre had built their foundries, a place where the silence of the temple broke into the roar of molten fire. Here, bronze was born, and with it, the myth of divine craftsmanship. The workers called him Hiram Abif, the son of a widow, master of metal, sent by King Hiram of Tyre to serve the king of Israel. Scripture remembers him as filled with wisdom, understanding, and skill to work in all kinds of bronze. But the legends that followed made him something more, the architect of mystery itself. Hiram's furnaces ran day and night. Cedar wood fed the flames. Charcoal hissed under the bellows. Streams of liquid fire poured into clay molds, spilling light across the valley floor. To stand there was to see creation itself repeated, the formless becoming form, chaos shaped by will. The Hebrews saw it as a miracle. The Phoenicians saw it as metallurgy. Solomon saw it as power. Bronze, the marriage of copper and tin, was not new. But under Hiram, it became a theology. He mixed the alloys by moonlight, timing the pour with celestial precision. The flames shifted from red to blue, a chemical truth that became a spiritual symbol. The priests called it the breath of the divine. The artisans called it simply heat. At 200 degrees, the boundary between sacred and practical disappeared. The fire that purified idols also forged empire. Every cauldron, basin, lampstand, and altar was born in that blue glow, a reminder that holiness, like metal, must be smelted before it shines. Hiram's greatest work was not a weapon, but a basin, a sea that held no tide. The molten sea, as it came to be called, measured 10 cubits from brim to brim, 5 cubits high and 30 in circumference. It stood upon 12 bronze oxen, 3 facing each direction of the compass, symbolizing the tribes, the seasons, the order of creation itself. When filled, it held over 10 gallons of water. It was used by priests to purify themselves before entering the holy place. But more than ritual, it was revelation, a circle resting upon beasts, the cosmos anchored upon creation. Archaeologists call it artistry, theologians call it cosmology. But the men who built it knew better. It was a miracle of math. Each ox was cast separately, then welded together, a feat of alignment so precise that no seams were visible. The heat required to mold it could melt stone. Only the forges of Tyre could sustain that temperature, and thus, even in the house of God, the fire of pagans burned. At the temple's entrance, Hiram raised 2 giants of bronze, Jachin and Boaz. They towered 40 feet into the air, ornamented with lattice work and pomegranate crowns. No one could explain their purpose. They supported no weight. They held no inscription. They simply stood. To modernize, they were symbols of balance, duality, establishment, and strength. But to ancient worshippers, they were reminders that faith needed form and power needed spectacle. When light hit them at dawn, the reflections cast moving shadows on the courtyard floor, like living fire engraved upon the stone. It was theater disguised as theology. Tyre had given Solomon more than bronze and cedar. It had given him a world view. In Phoenician culture, the divine was material. Gods lived in form, in metal, wood, ivory. Worship was craftsmanship. In Israel, the divine was invisible. Spirit, word, commandment. Worship was obedience. The temple fused the two. It made the invisible visible, a god beyond idols, but dwelling in golden rooms. It was a paradox Solomon embraced. He had married the daughter of Pharaoh, befriended the king of Tyre, and surrounded himself with foreign craftsmen. To his priests, it was scandal. To his court, it was progress. To Solomon, it was destiny. For the first time, faith had become an export. Behind every miracle stood logistics. For every ornament that glittered on the altar, there were schedules, ledgers, and burn rates. Copper arrived from Etzion-Geber, tin from the mines of Anatolia, fuel from the forests of Bashan. Shipments were tracked, guarded, taxed. Each ingot bore the royal seal, a sunburst enclosed in a triangle, the mark of Solomon's treasury. Faith had acquired an accounting department, and the priests, though they spoke of heaven, were financed by earth. The chroniclers never mention Hiram's death. They say only that his work was finished, but later stories, whispered in Phoenician ports and Hebrew markets alike, tell of jealousy, rivalry, and silence. Hiram had become too admired, too essential. He held secrets of alloys and architecture no one else understood. The king grew wary of a foreigner wielding sacred knowledge. One night, the furnaces dimmed. By morning, Hiram was gone. Some said he was assassinated by jealous masons. Others said he vanished into his own fire, ascending as smoke to join the gods he forged for others. In Tyre, they called him martyr. In Israel, they erased his name from the record, but the legend survived. The myth of a craftsman who built God's house and was buried beneath its silence. When the temple was completed, the priests cleansed the courtyard with the water from Hiram's sea. Then, they lit the first altar fire. The flames rose high, dancing blue like the forges of Tyre. And as the people fell to their knees, believing they saw the fire of heaven descend, Solomon alone understood what he was witnessing. It was not heaven. It was chemistry. The Phoenicians had taught him how to burn copper salts into flame. He smiled, not in mockery, but in understanding. For even a miracle must be engineered. As the smoke curled toward the sky, the gold walls caught its reflection, turning light into liquid motion. The people saw revelation, the king saw power, and the craftsman saw truth. That divinity, once molten, could be shaped into anything. From the blue fire of Tyre to the silent stones of Moriah, faith had become the finest alloy of all. Forged by human hands, polished by belief, and hardened by empire. But every alloy corrodes, and every flame, no matter how divine, eventually cools. The day the ark arrived, the city stopped breathing. For 7 years Jerusalem had echoed with hammer and chant. But on that morning, even the wind seemed to kneel. The temple was finished. Gold blazed on every wall. Bronze shimmered in the courtyards, and smoke from the altars curled like incense fingers toward the sun. But the glory of craftsmanship meant nothing until it arrived. The Ark of the Covenant, the throne of the invisible God. Without it, the temple was an empty palace. With it, heaven itself would take residence on earth. The priests of Levi led the march, barefoot, robed in white linen, their shoulders bruised beneath the poles of acacia wood that bore the ark. Behind them came the trumpeters, then the singers, then the king. Solomon wore no crown that day, only a simple robe of scarlet and gold thread, symbol of both ruler and servant. The people lined the streets from the city of David to Mount Moriah, each one straining to see the box that legend said contained both law and lightning. The ark was small, 4 feet long, 2.5 wide, its surface overlaid with gold, its lid carved with 2 cherubim whose wings met at the center. But to those who watched, it was the weight of the cosmos. When the procession reached the temple's outer court, Solomon raised his hand. The trumpets ceased. The priests lifted the ark, and the crowd fell to their knees. As they crossed the inner threshold, the noise of the world stopped. No tool, no whisper, no breath, only the sound of footsteps on polished stone. They passed through the curtain, a veil woven of blue, purple, and crimson threads, and entered the Holy of Holies. No windows, no torches, only darkness, thick as velvet. There, the priests set the ark upon the foundation stone, the same rock, it was said, from which God had formed the earth. And in that moment, the darkness became light. A wind moved through the temple. Though no doors were open, the gold lamps flickered, the curtains shivered, and a cloud began to rise from the inner chamber. Scripture says the glory of the Lord filled the house. Historians say the sudden smoke was caused by the first ignition of incense on the altar. But for those inside, it was neither chemistry nor chance. It was presence. The priests fell on their faces. Some screamed, others wept. The sound was like thunder beneath stone. And Solomon, the man who built silence, finally spoke. He stepped onto the bronze platform in the courtyard, raised his hands toward heaven, and said, "O Lord, the heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built?" It was humility spoken through architecture, a confession carved in gold, but what followed was not submission. It was strategy. Hear from heaven, and when you hear, forgive. Forgiveness, Solomon implied, now had an address, a location, a physical doorway through which mercy could be scheduled, petitioned, recorded. It was faith turned bureaucratic. The divine now lived behind measurable walls. When the prayer ended, the people erupted in worship. Trumpets blared, sacrifices bled onto the new altars, and the valley echoed with joy. But not everyone rejoiced. Among the Levites, an older priest named Zadok looked uneasy. He had carried the ark for decades through wilderness and war, and now, for the first time, it stood still. He whispered to another priest. This box was meant to move. The words vanished beneath the roar of celebration, but he was right. The ark was born in motion, built for exile, for the uncertain path between desert and promise. Now it was imprisoned by gold, what Solomon called rest, the priests called captivity. That night, after the ceremonies had ended, Solomon walked alone through the silent courtyards. Torches flickered along the walls, casting light that bent and warped across the bronze sea and pillars. He entered the sanctuary, alone, forbidden even to priests. Before him, the veil hung heavy. Behind it, the ark glowed faintly, illuminated by oil lamps that burned low and steady. He stood there for a long time, watching the shadows shift across the golden walls. The sound of distant wind echoed through the pillars. It reminded him of his father's songs, psalms of open fields and shepherds' prayers. But this was no field. This was a vault. He whispered to himself, "I have built a dwelling place for the Lord." And though no one answered, the silence did. The temple was both miracle and monument, a perfect system of faith and control. But perfection, like metal, bends under its own weight. In his private chambers, Solomon began to ask the question his father once asked on the battlefield. If God is everywhere, why does he need a house? It was the one question no priest dared write down, and the one every thinker since has asked, was the temple a bridge between heaven and earth, or a prison that caged both? The dedication of the temple changed Israel forever. The people no longer looked upward to invisible clouds, but eastward, toward Jerusalem. Prayer now had direction, faith had geography, and Solomon, once merely king, became something more. the keeper of the covenant's address. His reign became theology in motion, sacrifice by schedule, worship by ordinance, salvation by construction. The empire of belief was complete. But beneath the triumph, a shadow began to grow. Hiram was gone. The laborers were restless. The prophets were silent. And Solomon, the man of wisdom, had begun collecting more than gold. Wives from foreign courts, alliances carved in silk, altars built for peace that looked suspiciously like compromise. Each union brought new gods, new symbols, new shrines. He told himself it was diplomacy. The priests called it heresy. The man who built the house for one god was now opening windows to many. One evening, years later, Solomon returned to the Holy of Holies. The lamp still burned. The ark still sat upon its stone, but the air felt different. Colder, heavier. He knelt. No voice came. No cloud rose. No wind stirred. Only silence. The same silence he had once commanded to build the walls. He realized then that the house he had made for God was now empty of both sound and presence. The glory had not departed. It had simply never belonged. When Solomon rose from the floor, he looked upon the golden walls one last time. They gleamed in the torchlight, beautiful and hollow. He whispered, "Perhaps the ark was meant to wander." Outside, the city slept. The temple shone like a jewel under the moon. And somewhere in that glow, the first crack of empire spread. Quiet, invisible, inevitable. Because faith, once captured, begins to decay, and silence, once perfected, becomes its own god. The temple was finished. The gold had cooled. The nation had peace. And Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, began to forget what wisdom was for. Peace turned to luxury. Luxury turned to appetite. And appetite, when crowned, becomes law. What began as faith became fashion. What began as covenant became collection. And what began as the kingdom of God slowly became the kingdom of Solomon. The chroniclers call it the Golden Age. 40 years without invasion. 40 years of trade, art, and architecture. Caravans crossed the deserts carrying spices, ivory, peacocks, and gold. Ships of Tarshish brought silver from Spain and sandalwood from Ophir. In Jerusalem, the markets sang with tongues from Egypt, Arabia, and Phoenicia. Every gate glittered, every tower shone, every hall echoed with the sound of foreign instruments. But gold has gravity. It bends even the strongest faith toward itself. The temple still stood at the city's heart. But the heart of the king had begun to wander. Solomon married for peace. At first, Pharaoh's daughter brought the Nile to his court. A princess from Tyre brought ships and cedar. A Moabite noble brought access to trade routes east of the Jordan. Each marriage brought wealth, and with it, compromise. Soon, his alliances became a map of temptation. One wife became 10. 10 became 100. 100 became 1,000. 700 wives of royal blood. 300 concubines. The palace swelled into a labyrinth of languages and gods. In one courtyard, incense burned for Yahweh. In another, offerings smoked for Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians. On a hill across the valley, shrines were raised to Chemosh of Moab and Molech of Ammon. From the temple's roof, one could see the altars of Israel's king, competing with the altars of his enemies. The law of Moses had been clear. You shall have no other gods before me. But Solomon had rewritten law into tolerance. He called it wisdom. The prophets called it apostasy. Every altar was a treaty, every idol, an agreement. Every prayer, a transaction. The man who had once built the house of the Lord was now building houses for every god that could keep his empire stable. It was diplomacy disguised as devotion. and devotion disguised as pragmatism. The line between wisdom and cunning blurred, and then vanished. For 20 years, the prophets had been silent. Then one morning, a man named Ahijah came from the north. He walked into the king's courtyard without permission. The guards hesitated. Something in his eyes made them step aside. Solomon was dictating trade policy when the old man entered. Ahijah said nothing at first. He tore his cloak into 12 pieces and placed 10 on the floor before the king. Then he said, "Because you have divided your heart, your kingdom shall be divided. 10 tribes will be taken from you and given to another. Only one shall remain for the sake of David." Solomon stared at the rags on the floor. Each fragment of cloth, a fragment of empire. The old man turned and left. He was never seen in the palace again. In the years that followed, the great machine of Solomon's empire began to rust. Tribute from the northern tribes grew late. Tax collectors were beaten in the streets. The work crews that once built temples now built walls, not of faith, but of fear. Trade ships returned with less gold and more rumors. Tyre demanded higher prices. Egypt, once an ally, sent armies to patrol the borders. Even the temple treasury began to empty. Gold shields were replaced with bronze. Lavish processions grew smaller. The music at the festivals sounded hollow. The silence that had once been holy now felt ominous. Solomon's nights grew restless. He walked the halls of the palace alone, surrounded by the smell of foreign perfumes and the faint echo of laughter that was never in his own tongue. In the gardens, he passed the idols his wives had built, stone faces staring through torchlight. Their eyes seemed to follow him. He stopped before one altar, a carved figure of the goddess Astarte, half woman, half lion. At its base, the ashes of offerings still smoldered. He whispered, "I built the house of the Lord, and now I light fires for strangers." The idol did not answer, neither did heaven. There is a cruel symmetry in history. The wiser the man, the sharper the fall. Solomon had asked for wisdom, and wisdom was granted, not as comfort, but as clarity. He saw the fractures before anyone else. He knew the kingdom could not endure divided. He knew the temple would one day stand empty. He knew the silence he had built would outlast every prayer. And still, he kept building. Because what is an empire if not a structure built against fear? He wrote, "I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and chasing after wind." It was not philosophy, it was confession. The old laborers who had built the temple were gone. Their sons now served foreign idols on foreign hills. The quarries lay empty, filled with stagnant water. The forges of Tyre had gone cold. The roads that once carried cedar now carried soldiers. And through it all, the temple stood unchanged, a monument to the man who no longer prayed inside it. The ark was still there, the gold still shone, but the presence had left. Only ritual remained. Faith had become memory, and memory had become dust. In his final years, Solomon wrote not decrees, but laments. He sat beneath the colonnades of his palace and watched the sun set over the mountains of Judah. He wrote of vanity, of labor without purpose, of wisdom that brings sorrow. He wrote of a time when men built temples and forgot the God they were built for. And in the margin of one scroll, a line was found centuries later, faint, almost erased. Perhaps wisdom was never to be possessed, only endured. When Solomon died, the people mourned their king, but the silence that followed was not peace. Within a generation, the kingdom would fracture, north against south, brother against brother. The temple would remain, but the God who once filled it would grow silent again. The gold would gleam, but under the torchlight, its reflection looked strangely like fire. Because every empire built on faith and pride eventually burns. And every man who builds heaven on earth must one day stand before what he's made and call it by its true name, dust. The empire did not collapse in a single day. It dissolved in silence. The same silence Solomon once commanded. When the king died, there was no fire, no prophecy, no angel at the gate, just the slow echo of chisels fading across the hills of Jerusalem. The man who built a house for God was buried in a tomb of his own making, and above him the temple stood untouched, perfect, eternal, and empty. His son Rehoboam took the throne, young, proud. He carried his father's ring, but not his father's restraint. At his coronation, the people gathered and spoke plainly. "Your father made our yoke heavy. Lighten it, and we will serve you." But Rehoboam turned to his advisers, not the old men who had stood beside David, but the young ones who had grown up beside gold. They whispered, "Tell them your little finger is thicker than your father's loins." It was advice carved from arrogance, and it broke the nation. 10 tribes walked away that day, leaving Jerusalem behind. The kingdom split like the prophet had warned, north to Israel, south to Judah. The sound of hammers never returned. In the southern hills, the temple still shone. Priests lit incense, sacrifices burned, psalms were sung, but the smoke rose into an empty sky. The ark remained in the inner chamber, its gold dimmed by age, its silence heavier than stone. The people still prayed, but their prayers echoed back unanswered. Faith had become theater, a script rehearsed long after the actors had forgotten why it was written. The same hands that once built wonders now collected taxes for priests who no longer believed in miracles. In the north, Jeroboam, once Solomon's own servant, built rival altars to keep his tribes from returning to Jerusalem. 2 golden calves, set in Dan and Bethel. He told the people, "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The irony was unbearable. The same words once cursed at Sinai were now repeated in new temples, for the same people, in the same land. History had come full circle, faith imitating idolatry, idolatry pretending to be faith. And for the first time since the Exodus, the name of God no longer united his people. It divided them. Years turned into decades. The borders shrank. Allies fell silent. Trade faltered. In Jerusalem, the gold of the temple began to dim. The great shields of Solomon were taken down, their gleam replaced by dull bronze copies. Priests whispered that the treasury was nearly empty. The offerings no longer covered the cost of incense. Even the songs grew shorter, and yet the rituals continued, as if repetition could replace revelation. The people still bowed, but not to remember. They bowed because they were afraid of what forgetting might mean. The invasion then came Shishak, the pharaoh of Egypt. He crossed the Sinai with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, the dust of his army rising like a second dawn. He did not come for conquest. He came for gold. The priests hid behind the altars. Rehoboam fled into the upper chambers, and when the Egyptian banners appeared at the gates, Jerusalem surrendered without a fight. Shishak entered the temple. No army resisted him. He took the treasures of the house of the Lord, the shields, the vessels, the golden lampstands, and even the sacred gold that lined the inner walls. He left the ark, not out of reverence, but because it was too heavy to move. By the time he returned to Egypt, the temple that once defined an empire had become an echoing shell. Centuries later, when chroniclers wrote of that day, they softened the language. They said the Lord allowed it to humble his people. But humility was not the lesson. It was the result. The same empire that once claimed to hold heaven now could not hold a gate. The people spoke the old prayers. but the words felt foreign in their mouths. They still called the place holy, but they knew, somewhere deep inside, that holiness had left long ago. The silence inside the Holy of Holies was no longer sacred. It was abandonment. In the ruins of the northern border towns, a voice began to rise. Harsh, clear, uninvited. Prophets, men without rank or temple. Voices crying from dust and wilderness. They spoke of judgment, of false altars, of the day the Lord would tear down the walls built in His name. Your sacrifices mean nothing, they said. Your songs are noise. Your incense is smoke in the nostrils of heaven. The priests dismissed them, the kings silenced them, but history would prove them right. Empires do not fall because their enemies are strong. They fall because they forget who they are. By the time Solomon's descendants ruled their final years, Jerusalem had become a museum of glory. Tourists from distant lands came to see the wonders of the old king. They marveled at the pillars, the bronze sea, the carvings of cherubim that no longer guarded anything. Faith had become archaeology, the miracle of the Red Sea, the fire of Elijah, the wisdom of Solomon. All were stories to entertain visitors, not truths to build nations. And yet, the people clung to the stones, as if the stones themselves could still pray. The empire of Solomon lasted less than a century. Its memory lasted thousands of years. That is the cruel gift of greatness. Its ruins are more durable than its purpose. The temple would rise again, rebuilt by others, by kings seeking legitimacy, by priests seeking relevance. But every time it stood a little less holy. The ark would vanish, the gold would fade, and the silence that once signified faith would become the sound of God's absence. In the end, the story of Solomon's temple is not about stone or gold. It is about memory. How men build monuments to what they once believed and call the result eternal. The empire forgot God, but God did not forget the empire. He left it exactly as it wished to be, grand, admired, and utterly alone, because the greatest judgment in history was not destruction, it was silence, and silence, once built into the heart of faith, becomes the only voice that remains. There are places where history never ends. It just changes language. Jerusalem is one of them. Long after Solomon's bones turned to dust, the city still glowed under the desert sun, its hills scarred with the outlines of vanished walls. The temple was gone, but its shadow still divided the world. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell across the same valley. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Rome. Each left its mark in stone. Each believed it would be the last. When Nebuchadnezzar's armies came from the east, Jerusalem burned for 40 days. The temple, Solomon's masterpiece, was torn apart block by block. The ark disappeared. Some say it was hidden beneath the Temple Mount. Others say it was carried into heaven by fire. No one ever saw it again. All that remained was silence. The same silence Solomon had built his walls around. But this time, it was not sacred. It was grief. The survivors were marched east in chains. They crossed the same deserts their ancestors once crossed in freedom. In Babylon, they sat beside foreign rivers and wept for Zion. The prophets called it punishment. The poets called it memory. They told each other stories of the temple, the smell of cedar, the gleam of gold, the sound of the trumpets echoing off marble. They promised their children, one day, we will rebuild it. But in exile, they learned something the temple had hidden from them, that faith could live without walls, that prayer could survive without place, that holiness was not a room. It was a relationship. The absence became revelation when Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon. He sent the exiles home. They found the city in ruins, its stones blackened, its altars shattered, its holy mountain silent. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuilt the walls, and with trembling hands, they laid the foundations for a new temple. It was smaller, humbler, without the grandeur of Solomon's age. But it was built with something the first temple never had: repentance. There were no cedar palaces this time, no alliances sealed by gold, only tired hands and a vow never to forget again. And yet, as centuries passed, the same cycle began to turn. By the time Rome ruled the world, the temple had become grand again. Herod the Great, half king, half tyrant, expanded it into one of the wonders of the age. The courtyards filled with merchants. The priests wore silk instead of linen, and the same prayers Solomon once spoke were now recited by men counting coins behind the altars. Faith had returned to stone, and stone had returned to pride. When rebellion came, Rome answered with fire. In 70 AD, Titus's legions surrounded Jerusalem. They breached the walls, stormed the sanctuary, and burned the temple to its foundation. The smoke rose for miles. The gold melted into the cracks of the stones, and once again, the silence returned. Not divine, not sacred, but final. But ideas, unlike walls, do not burn. Centuries later, on that same mountain, another faith would rise. To Jews, it remained the place of the first and second temples. To Christians, it became the shadow of the veil that once tore in two. To Muslims, it became the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, the place where another prophet would ascend to heaven. Three faiths, one mountain, each claiming the memory of the same God, each hearing a different echo in the same silence. And somewhere in the center of that silence, the question remained, the one Solomon once whispered to the walls: can God truly dwell on earth? No one ever answered, but the fact that the question still lives may be the only answer history allows. Archaeologists still dig beneath Jerusalem's streets, hoping to touch the stones Solomon once laid. They find fragments, a seal, a burnt layer of ash, a piece of ivory carved with wings. None of it proves anything. All of it matters. Because belief is not built on proof. It is built on persistence. The temple may have fallen, but the idea behind it, the attempt to make the invisible visible, never did. Every cathedral, every mosque, every sanctuary built since is an echo of Solomon's first mistake and his first act of faith: to build a house for the uncontainable, to reach for heaven with hands made of dust. Even today, the Temple Mount remains, the most contested patch of earth on the planet, not because of what stands there, but because of what once did. The stones whisper through centuries of prayer and war. Pilgrims press their foreheads against them, hoping to feel something ancient move beneath their skin. And in the wind that moves across the mountain, you can almost hear it. The faint rhythm of chisels, the sound of a hammer that once struck without noise. The silence of Solomon lives on, not as peace, but as memory. History calls Solomon's temple one of mankind's first great architectural triumphs. Faith calls it something else, a warning, a reminder that every time man tries to build heaven on earth, he ends up walling himself in. The first temple fell to pride, the second to politics. The third, if it ever comes, may fall to the same. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the story was never about stone, or king, or gold. Maybe it was about what happens when silence becomes sacred, and sacredness forgets how to speak. 3,000 years after the first hammer struck the first stone, Jerusalem still breathes under the same sky. The temple is gone, but its blueprint remains. not in walls, but in hearts. Every believer who builds, every skeptic who questions, every historian who searches for meaning in the dust, they are all still standing in Solomon's courtyard, listening for a sound that has not returned. And if you stand there long enough, in the wind, beneath the gold light of dawn, you will hear it too. The faint, impossible echo of a kingdom that tried to make the infinite visible and found only silence. Solomon's temple was more than stone. It was a mirror, reflecting both man's reach for heaven and heaven's quiet refusal to be contained. The walls may be gone, but the silence remains, and in that silence, the story of faith still speaks.